For people that haven't heard that term, nootropic, what is it? Let's start there.
Yeah, so nootropics was a term created by a Romanian chemist and psychologist back, I think he coined it around 1972.
These are the superheroes of the nootropic field at this point.
Caffeine is a rock star for not for everything on the pyramid, but that base layer.
What are some other restorative ideas?
So they'll usually use the idea of soft fascinations, things that we don't really have to think about when we look at them. So nature, like green spaces would be a big one, moving water of any sort, a fish tank.
What do people do? Can they fix this mental energy problem?
Yes, I often think of,
Dr. Kelly, welcome to the podcast.
oh, it's a thrill to be here today and get to talk with you and share some things about the brain with your audience.
Brain health, it's so important, right? And not enough people know about it, what to do. But I mean, as someone that looks at labs for a living and talks to people about these things, I can tell you things like brain fog, fatigue, feeling dysregulated, and just not the sharpest. It is ubiquitous, but not should be settled for, right? Common, not normal, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the reason the company I work for, Qualia, was founded was the recognition that the world would be a better place if people had more support in, optimizing how their brain performed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, how did you get into this? I mean, each one of us in healthcare has like a unique story, fascinating story into how did it find us, right? What's yours?
Yeah, so for listeners, I'm a naturopathic doctor, but my first career was an officer in the Navy, and I was the weird officer that would bring food onto the ship to eat and exercised, and so I was in, interested in health, but maybe more like vanity in my early to mid 20s in the Navy than for health's sake. And then I owed 6 years, did most of those active duty, and knew I was getting out for about a year before I officially did my last stay in the Navy, and
Mhm.
had planned to just get rid of everyone and be what we would call now a digital nomad, but without the digital part. And realized that to do that, I needed to know more about taking care of myself, and
Mm.
somehow stumbled on a book in the library on the base that had chapters on herbs and chiropractic and homeopathy and all these things I'd never heard of, and thought like, wow, like there's a whole world of these modalities out there. And long story short, I never became the nomad. Did make it to Thailand at one point and studied at a university there, but encountered a bunch of naturopaths in Hawaii and thought, cool, they're doing all these things I've been trying to piecemeal together on my own. And so shifted gears from the journeying around with a backpack to becoming an ND.
I love it. Where are you from originally? Which part of the world?
Yeah, I grew up in between Boston and Cape Cod, right in a little
Okay.
fishing, lobstering town, and
Yeah.
right on the beach. My parents' house was, I could look out my bedroom window and see the ocean. So it's
Wow.
really fortunate.
I I'm into. I look at raw gene data for telehealth patients as far as methylation and detox and HLA, and I mainly look at that from a genetic epigenetic sort of interplay. But I also on the side, I'm like a novice. Ancestry research historian, by no means professionally done. It's just a hobby, and I traced my one of my family lines all the way to the 1600s when they first came, like the Puritans, or whatever, and they landed in Ipswich,
Mm.
Massachusetts, near you originally. Yeah, so I just said that just for a random factoid, but it's so cool to think how much history is where you were raised, right? I mean, it's ancient. Even before that, the indigenous people, the tribes there had a whole civilization
Yeah,
we don't even appreciate anymore, but we should.
I know my town is Situate would be the name. Ipswich is up more the north of Boston.
Hmm.
And it's an old, like name from the Native American Indians that lived there, for a little brook that runs through the town.
Yeah.
But my town was founded by the men of Kent, is what, and there was a classmate that had that surname. So there was people in
Yeah.
my town that dated way, way back. I'm a
Wow.
newer. I'm Irish American, so my
Okay.
ancestors mostly came over in my great grandparent generation.
Very cool. Very cool. I love that area. I got to explore Boston once. I was there for a Limes conference, an ILADS conference, and got to, learn about all the latest advancements in tick-borne illness, but also got to see the amazing cemeteries and interesting things of Boston. I love it. So let's jump into this. Mental energy. Can you give us a high level view of what we're talking about when we discuss mental energy and how it's this finite resource that can become depleted for people?
Yeah, you can think of mental energy as both um, an allegory for what goes on in the brain, but the brain's also a physical system, and we know just biochemically it uses more energy than any other part. So usually the
Hmm.
estimate is about 20% of the
Yeah.
calories we ingest go to fueling the brain.
Hmm.
And there's a few important things to understand about the brain and energy. One is most of the things that you talked about, like the brain fog, issues with managing our emotions, feeling
Hmm.
like we run out of juice in the afternoon. All of those, to some extent, can be traced to physical energy.
Hmm.
And so mental energy, when that term's used, it typically bundles three different things together. So it's more subjective in its use. And one would be a feeling of having enough energy to do what we need to do. One would be motivation, crazy important. And then the
Hmm.
last would be that sense of having focus and being able to focus our attention on what we want for prolonged periods of time. So
Hmm.
mental energy, it's really that triad. But a lot of that does boil down to the physical energy component.
Hmm. So, I mean, this is a big question. When you look at the data and the rise of chronic inflammatory problems, neuroinflammation, right? We know it's rising, but is there any way? I mean, what's your view on the fact of are more people struggling with this today in our modern times, or we just know more about it and talking more about it? What's your take?
I think it's maybe more the former than the latter, but both. That we clearly know way more about, the brain and how it works.
Yeah.
But just looking, so I tend to think of the brain in a pyramid type of system, right? There's the and this would be for daytime performance. The base of the pyramid would be, what's thought of as arousal or vigilance, right? We're awake and we're alert. And if we don't have that, it's hard to get anywhere higher on the pyramid in terms of how our brain performs. But the
Hmm.
next layer up is what neuroscientists would call complex attention. And so attention is, focusing our awareness on something, keeping it there, avoiding distractions, processing speed, all those things go together. And then above that is things like executive function or social cognition would be how neuroscientists talk about them. But executive functions would be managing our emotions, setting our goals, doing the hard thing when it's the right
Hmm.
thing. And social cognition are things like our empathy and being able to kind of read other people, that type of
Hmm.
thing, and being what's called interoception, the awareness of our own internal sensations. So
Hmm.
what seems to be the case is it's harder to get to the top things on the pyramid if the base isn't satisfied. And there's so many things that compete for our attention, for that complex attention layer, right? Way more than when I would have been, doing my naturopathic degree, even in the mid 90s. And there was more then than there was when I did my first university degree in the early 80s. So I think
Hmm.
the environment makes it really hard to get to these higher levels because we're just so tapped out on the lower parts of the pyramid. And then
Hmm.
things like, that you would know well, like if we don't get enough sleep, we're not even going to have that foundational level
Hmm.
satisfied well.
Yeah. So you're talking about some of these higher level signs and symptoms, telltale signs that somebody may have depleted, their cognitive pool is depleted. But what are some other signs that maybe like people aren't, it's not connecting yet on, and so many people gaslight themselves around this, right? Because we're just used to people live their day, they're pushing through. It's not necessarily a great quality day, but they muster up enough, energy and focus to get by. There's a difference between getting by and optimal. So can you kind of give some other indications, some aha moments for people to think, yeah, I could actually optimize this?
Yeah, so my dad um, commuted a pretty brutal commute into Boston to give me the opportunity to live in a great place right by the ocean in Situate. And I'm sure like his, going out of the house in the morning was a glass of orange juice and a cup of black coffee is my recollection. And then, hour and a half or so commute, he was a president of a big engineering company. So, pretty mentally demanding job. And then if anything, a worse commute coming back. So what my dad would show up on often when he would walk through the door would be that grouchy, irritable kind of archetype, right?
Yeah.
And to me, that's not a character issue as much as in my dad's case, a sign that his tank was depleted probably hours before that. And then when that's the case, we need that time to recharge. So that would be a telltale sign, right? Like at the end of the day, how are we showing up for the people that are most important in our life? Do we still have the mental resources, the kind of the energy to put into those people that really deserve our best self and often get the leftovers? So that would be one
Mm.
example.
That's a great example. Great example. I mean, so many people mistake dysregulation or suboptimal function for their personality, right? And because it's going on for so long, they're just like, I am anxious. I am tightly wound. I just tell it like it is. I'm just irritable. But if it can be reversed, it's not a personality, type. So can you, any other, these are really beautiful life pearls for people to have aha moments. Any other signs you can think of that people could have that
Yeah,
aha moment?
it just like so another super common thing would be somewhat of a slump after eating lunch, two-ish, right? Like that's we take that for granted. Maybe we go get, a Starbucks or energy
Yeah.
drink or something. But we should be able to have steady, consistent energy across the day. Not to say that our brain doesn't have some ebbs and flows, because it does. Like we're not supposed to just stay often, undistracted, focusing on the same thing hour after hour, but we
Mm-hmm.
should have enough resources to pull through that. So, that would be another classic one. Like in general, I think of like almost the flip side of those two higher level, executive function and social cognition. So, going back to executive function, is some of the characteristics of high level performance there are setting goals and then following through on those. Being able to do what would be called inhibition, but it's overriding if we decide we're not going to have a cookie today and we have the cookie instead, right? We override that. Or we decide at the beginning of the day, I'm going to go to the gym on the way home and we're not feeling it and just drive home instead, right? Those are all signs that somewhere the tank ran dry, right?
Mm-hmm.
That executive part of our brain isn't having enough resources to do the hard thing when it's the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then social cognition, biggie, right? Like, so managing our emotions, having empathy for others, right? I know I see a lot of that. And when I see that, it's, again, I don't take it as a character thing. I just think, oh, there's a brain that didn't have enough resources to
Mm-hmm.
do, those important jobs. And then one of the things that's super important to understand about the brain is that it takes way less energy when someone is good at it to do that thing than it does for someone that's not skilled in that to do that same behavior. So, this would be a simple illustration, but I don't play the piano. If I was to try to learn the piano, my brain would be using a lot more energy to play poorly than someone that's already good at the piano would use to play really well. And
Mm-hmm.
so what it ends up this almost catch 22 of sorts, right? If we're not good at empathy, it takes our brain a lot more energy to even run like a rudimentary empathy software
Mm-hmm.
program. And so, of course, that's going to be, not on the menu if the brain's running short of energy.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you mentioned earlier, like we often would describe ourselves like, oh, I don't have empathy, or I'm a grouchy person, or I'm anxious. And those are states that, in my mind, often it's just saying, oh, my brain's doesn't have what it needs to run that. And that would be for me, maybe a little more energy demanding thing than for Dr. Will or
Mm-hmm.
Greg. And, so their brains can run it, mine's not, but it's, all our brains can do it.
Hmm. Yeah, certainly. Okay, so you've spoke to a lot of people right there. That people are like, I'm not showing up the best in my relationships. I kind of quote unquote lack willpower. My goals are one thing and I fall short. I'm feeling depleted. I'm feeling wired and tired, anxious, exhausted, feeling, dysregulated. Their cognitive pool is depleted. Is there hope for people out there? I know the answer to this, but I mean, I'm setting up for you.
Yeah.
Like, what do people do? Can they fix this mental energy problem?
Yes, I often think of doing three things. One, organizing what we expect of our brain better. So, like as an example, um, you know, the people that have spent their life researching the attentional system, as an example, would say it's completely normal that over even the course of an hour, there'd be some ebbs and flows where, we're not going to be as peak focused. So, taking breaks periodically. And the way I would understand this is that if we're working one part of the brain heavily, so for me, reading studies, maybe I have a bunch of studies I'm going to get to, that's going to cause, at least locally, certain parts of my brain to be working harder. And over even a moderate amount of time, they'll start to run out of juice, so to speak. And then there may be plenty of glucose somewhere else in my brain or in my blood, but you have to reallocate it.
Mm-hmm.
And taking periodic breaks is that opportunity. As long as in that break, we don't use the same part of the brain in the same way. So a
Mm-hmm.
horrible break for me, if I was on my computer reading studies, would be get on my phone and do something on my phone. Well, a
Mm-hmm.
much better break, and I live near the ocean in northern San Diego County, would be just to get out and walk down and look at the waves, or walk around the block and letting my mind wander. Do the opposite of focus for that.
Mm-hmm.
And a good rule of thumb is, if we can schedule it in our day, 5 minutes every, hour or so, just for that, what would neuroscientists would call it attentional restoration. So that would be
Mm-hmm.
one thing that goes a long way. It doesn't seem like a lot, but it is. And often
Yeah.
creative things come to me in that little break,
Mm-hmm.
just because now I'm creativity is almost the opposite of focus. We need to let focus recede to have that creative inspiration. Another is we tend to think that multitasking is both cool and something our brain can do, but it can't. What the brain does is rapidly switch back and forth on things. And that costs more energy than if we just focus on one thing. So, as much as possible, doing things to turn off notifications, checking our email maybe, less frequently, or having it not as visible to distract us. And so giving ourselves an opportunity to get in a groove and stay there.
Mm-hmm.
Because each time our focus is removed from something, there's a lag.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a little bit to get back into that same groove, and more energy to get back into it than if we had just stayed in that focus thing. So those would be, two things that most of us can do that aren't hard. And then the last area, it falls into the bucket of nootropics, which can
Yeah.
be really what I think of as resources for the brain to give a much fuller tank to get through our day.
Love it. And we're going to go into a deep dive on nootropics. So the first two you said was the restoration. How often does the science show we should be refreshing with those restorative times?
I don't know that there's been like a hard study, but the people
Yeah.
that are most experts would say ideally about once an hour, if you can
Once an
budget
hour.
in five
And
minutes.
even, you said 5 minutes. So for you, it's getting outside. Or like, what are some other examples? Maybe people can't get outside every hour. What are some other restorative ideas?
So they'll usually use the idea of soft fascinations, things that we don't really have to think about when we look at them. So nature, right? Green
Mm-hmm.
spaces would be a big one. Moving water of any sort, a fish tank would be another. And some of those, it would be a screen, but you could pull those up on YouTube or something else and just watch and let your mind just do the opposite of focus. Just
Mm-hmm.
relax into that natural scene would
Got it.
be, a way
And
to do
you
it.
and you mentioned sort of creativity and focus being almost like inversely proportional there. How would you, what's the mechanism there? What's your take on that? I never thought of it like that.
Yeah, so the brain's organized in networks. So, there's the executive network, which would map to what we described as executive function. There's the attentional network, which is complex attention. And when our attentional network is really active, the creative parts of our brain recede. There's also something called the default mode network, which is really our storyteller network, right? So the more the attentional network is active, the more some of these other networks recede because, again, energy, right? There's only so much to go around. If something's pulling a lot, the other things have to recede. And so creativity tends to almost be a toggle with that attentional network. If that's really active, then the things that are creative aren't, because creativity, in a sense, so I guess I've seen people use creativity two ways. One would be the process of creating. Like after inspiration has occurred and we're focused on our work to do the physical creation of it. But creativity in the way I was using it would be more that inspiration piece. And that
Hmm.
takes our attentional network to somewhat recede into the
Got it.
background.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was conflating. It's like the creative process I was conflating with the inspiration. You're absolutely right. Yeah, there needs to be this almost tranquil moment of present moment awareness. It's not on the doing, but the being. That's what you're talking about for that inspiration moment.
Yeah, and a lot of the best things that we produce in life come in those brief aha inspirational moments.
Yeah.
And if we don't afford ourselves those opportunities, then often we're stuck. We're and I see this on myself. Like I'll write long blogs sometimes, and the story piece will come together in my walk around the block,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll just
Oh
like, oh,
yeah.
this is what
Yeah.
like I can do to better explain this.
Absolutely. I mean, the weirdest things that I needed to get to link things within the book with books that I've written or whatever it is, some creative process. It normally doesn't come from when I'm sitting down. It's some other moment where I'm getting out of my head and in my body and just, refreshing, like you're saying. And the second point that you made here was the illusion of I'm good at multitasking. I mean, there's so many people that are out there like, yeah, I'm good at multitasking, but you're saying that's really a myth. I mean, maybe some people are better than others, but it's not actually, the brain's not great at it in and of itself.
Yeah, so what the brain could do, when I walk around the block, part of my brain can be, paying attention to the birds and the wind and things like that. Part can make sure I'm walking safely, things like that. But if there's especially like a high level thing we're doing, the brain can't switch back and forth between things. Every time we ask it to, there's a lag before it can really get back focused on that thing. So when we're talking about focused attention, yeah, we can't divide that. We can only
Hmm.
focus on one thing at a time.
So, any tips there? I mean, because our life is, you mentioned limit the amount of times that you look at the email. I think that's a great tip. I'm thinking of like block schedules. So, like instead of people like having a million things to do, any other practical tips of us blocking our day, whatever we can within what's possible for our specific situation. But I'm thinking that there's probably more effective ways for us to schedule our day, knowing this science.
Yeah, I think we all have um, times of day that we tend to be able to get into a focused state and do good work better. For me, that seems to be the afternoon, at least right now, and so I'm pretty guarded about that. I try to get any email things done in the morning. I don't check email as much in the afternoon. Once I get focused on whatever that one big, say, work task that I want to get
Hmm.
accomplished that day, then I'll just protect that time so that I don't, allow other distractions, because there's never going to be a shortage for most of us of things, clamoring for some of our time and attention. And I think the way to think about it is that both our time and attention are precious resources, and the world's not going to value them and make it easy for us to hoard those ourselves to do the best things for our personal circumstances. So we have to just be better at
Mm-hmm.
being good boundary setters for them.
Yeah, boundary setters. So multitasking, restorative moments. Something that comes to mind here is burnout, right? I mean, people use that term burnout because they really are perpetually, chronically multitasking and doing very little refreshing, restorative moments. Do you see that as sort of, I mean, what's the connection between that and what the world may call burnout?
Yeah, so I think it's called something like the Zygarnik effect or ZEI something. But the gist of it, it was this researcher that noticed our brain does really poorly when things don't get completed. It's like a part of our brain stays hovering or
Mm-hmm.
using some resources on that unfinished task. So when we have a whole bunch of things that are hanging out somewhere between started and not yet done, that ties up a whole bunch of our brain in unproductive ways. And it's
Mm-hmm.
probably evolutionarily sensible for it to want to get to completion on important things. And so, one would be, I think, expecting our brain to do fewer things and do them well, to the extent
Mm-hmm.
possible. And again, that's often communication, right? So, my job at Qualia, I'm often tasked with a whole bunch of different things, right? Creating products, going on podcasts, answering customer service questions. Um, you know, Sometimes it's just me talking to the president and saying like, Greg can do this and then that, but these other things, there's just no chance those are getting
Mm-hmm.
done in the next couple of weeks. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's giving ourselves permission that it's okay that,
Mm-hmm.
um, if we're doing our best and supporting our brain well, I think we perform better and get more done in less time. But quite often, some of getting that done is saying no to other
Mm-hmm.
things, or if not no, not yet. And then just putting that kind of in the future. And so what I do in my email, I'll in a normal day get some things I know I'm not going to get to today. So I just snooze that email until some future day where I'm optimistic that I might be able to get to that and that it would be a priority to do at that
Mm-hmm.
point. And often by the time that date comes up, it's not important anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So, so I think little tricks, but in part, um, understanding that our brain, when we're in the states that you just described, right? That's a sign that
Mm-hmm.
burnout, that what we're doing is not working. That
Mm-hmm.
either our brain needs a lot more resources, or we need to do a better job helping it spend what we have, or both.
Yeah, or both. Yeah, it normally is a both and solution, right? It is having that self compassion that we're not robots. We're surrounded by AI and things that algorithms and technology that we are not that. And we are so plugged into that that we forget that we are not that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about, a both and approach. We talked about somebody emptying that bucket, so to speak, with the first two advice. The third is how can we improve resilience? You mentioned nootropics. For people that haven't heard that term, nootropic, what is it? Let's start there.
Yeah, so nootropics was a term created by a Romanian chemist and psychologist back, I think he coined it around 1972, from French words that I think translate something like mind bending. But think of it now as we think of as neuroplasticity, right? This idea that the brain can reshape itself with experience. And so the original nootropic that he synthesized was something called paracetam, first in a category of racetams. They've never been turned into approved drugs. They kind of hang out in this nowhere land between approved drugs and dietary supplements, where they're not either. But that category of things was the original nootropic, and what his research, I guess, stepping back, his goal was originally to create something to help with sleep. He was trying to create something that worked on the GABA system, which is the brain's braking system of sorts, to
Mm-hmm.
help with sleep. And paracetam, it turned out, didn't do that at all. Instead, when he gave it to animals, they behaved smarter. They
Hmm.
learned better. Um, they, were able to just problem solve, do other things. And one of then his questions was why? What is this compound doing? And his original two observations, one had to do with ATP energy, that it seemed to like be upregulating the brain's energy production. And then the second one had to do with the cholinergic system. So acetylcholine for
Hmm.
listeners. Um, Dr. Cole knows that he's shaking his head, yes. But acetylcholine, and this is an oversimplified story, but I'm sure many listeners have heard the idea of 10,000 hours to excel in something, which is more, a general guideline than any type of a rule. Some people can get to expertise a lot quicker and some a lot slower.
Hmm.
But one of the important things for the 10,000 hours idea is it has to be focused repetition, right? So focused. It can't just be doing without doing
Hmm.
mindlessly won't ever get us to expertise. Certainly
Hmm.
not in a brief time. But then the other piece of that is relevance, would be the term neuroscientists use. And relevance, as an example, I still really remember well some of the books I read when I was a teenager or movies I saw them. Or still, I could tell you, words to music I knew back then. Where, I read a book 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure I could tell you much about the plot at this point, right? So when we're young, everything's crazy relevant. As we get
Yeah.
older, I mean, I've read hundreds of novels, so my brain, like, why should it pay particular attention and hold on to these people's story after I close the book when it knows I'm going to meet new characters here shortly? That's what I've trained my brain, right? So it's not as relevant to my brain to hold on to that. So
Yeah.
part of the goal always is relevance if we want learning and memory to be better. And that brings us back to the acetylcholine story. So
Hmm.
acetylcholine is released in part to say, hey, this is relevant, get better at paying
Hmm.
attention to it and the world around us and
Hmm.
changing the neuroplasticity to reshape the brain. So this shows up more in our memory. So acetylcholine ends up being a really important thing, and you see a lot of nootropic compounds that work in that cholinergic system.
Got it. So he's looking for GABAergic, but he found cholinergic with these neurotropics. So focus enhancing, this neurotransmitter that's responsible for focus and cognitive function. So what are some of your favorites? Like what are some of the best at this point that science is pointing to as being like, yeah, these are the superheroes of the nootropic field at this point?
Yeah, I go back to that pyramid that I mentioned early. So, um, caffeine is a rock star for not for everything on the pyramid, but that base layer, that arousal, that vigilance, and getting into that attention level. So, one of the things caffeine does is it brings the attentional network more forefront. So, people often feel that they can focus better. Now, caffeine won't do much for the things above that. So, it's kind of a little dicey on, if it's going to benefit anything in the executive function. It sometimes will for decision making or goal setting.
Hmm. Hmm.
Often it will make the social cognition worse, right? We are more irritable and other things, right? We,
Hmm.
especially not immediately after caffeine, but an hour, 2 hours later. And we
Hmm.
can talk about why that occurs. But caffeine, think of as one of those things that when we need more arousal, there's really nothing other than maybe a nap that will recharge our brain that will get us there quicker than
Hmm.
caffeine. And more is not better. So the nootropic amount of caffeine is usually thought of as something between maybe a half cup of coffee's amount of caffeine to maybe like a full small. And more than that doesn't pro promote more nootropic effects, but you do often get the more caffeinated effects
Yeah.
like the irritability and
Yeah.
anxiousness and jitteriness, things like that.
Okay,
So
so caffeine with these, targeted, judicious, effective doses with diminishing returns if you have too much.
yeah.
What are some other ones?
And then something called L-theanine, which is an amino acid like compound from green tea that one of the things it does is activate our alpha brain waves in the frontal cortex. And
Hmm.
think of that as like a calmer energy. So that stack of caffeine and L-theanine,
Yeah.
often in about a 2-to-1 ratio, like twice as much L-theanine to caffeine, it
Yeah.
is a really good nootropic stack for that sense of calm energy. So instead of that more caffeinated alone type of energy.
Yeah.
And the other thing just to realize with caffeine is I know we vilify, sugar. I don't personally. I'm a big honey and maple syrup fan, but
Hmm.
for people that tolerate those well, which I do. But when you think of caffeine, and this isn't a perfect analogy, but think of it a bit like turbo for the brain. It's not
Hmm.
exactly the same because that's more about oxygen use than fuel use. But what caffeine's
Hmm.
doing is it's causing neurotransmitters and other things to be spent a little faster, but it's not
Hmm.
replacing any energy. So what you would see in studies when caffeine's given with some form of energy, glucose would be the most common thing they study because
Hmm.
it's the brain's primary fuel, then typically caffeine won't cause that irritability and those other
Hmm.
things when it's just given on its own, which I see a lot of. A lot of the energy drinks are, sweetened with sucralose or something that would provide no caloric energy. So with
Hmm.
that, we're probably going to feel a lot more alert and aroused and then bonk pretty quickly. And
Yeah.
one of my favorite studies was a Red Bull sugar-free placebo study. And in many ways, the placebo far outperformed the sugar-free version of Red Bull, where the Red Bull with sugar actually performed pretty well for some of these demanding cognitive tasks.
Wow. Fascinating. Because the benefit was coming from the sugar and not all the other.
Yeah,
Uh,
going back to that, physical energy part of the brain, when our brain's working hard, it demands and uses a lot of glucose. And
hmm.
if we don't have that available, then it's going to, start to um, underperform pretty quickly. So,
Yeah.
and caffeine often is forcing our brain into using more resources,
Hmm.
which if we want to be focused, that
Hmm.
can be great. But if we didn't, provide some of those things. And so I think it's why, things like bulletproof coffee, people often would swear by, right? Because now the fat's supplying that
Hmm.
source of steady energy.
Hmm.
I tend to use honey and heavy whipping cream if I'm having coffee, but again, like some source of fast and slower energy for my
Hmm.
brain, and that works for me. So that's
Hmm.
caffeine. Like I said, some things get vilified, but often it's the amount and then how we use them that matter, not
Yeah.
the thing in isolation.
Got it. So your take on this sort of, let's just call it a cognitive enhancing coffee, would be heavy whipping cream and honey instead of like maybe the classic bulletproof, which would be mainly MCT, maybe ghee, and then sometimes they would use maple syrup in it, right, for the sweetener.
Yeah. So in different people, maybe different. We're not all like in a metabolic sense equal.
Hmm.
Well, our history, our age, our health. But for
Activity
me,
level.
that
Yeah.
that works really well, and the bulletproof approach works well. I just enjoy the taste of my way a lot better, and
Yeah.
often coffee
How,
than.
how, how, how much are you using? Like, what's your recipe for this coffee that you have?
Oh, so I it's not a lot. So it's about maybe a 10-ounce cup of coffee with then um about maybe um I don't know, like I just kind of pour it in, but probably it's probably like a half ounce of cream. I think fat gives coffee like is a really complementary taste. A treat would be brown cow yogurt, which is a cream at the top, and that cream layer of the coffee flavor, I think is delicious. And to me, um, good quality fats bring out a coffee flavor in a way that other things don't. So, the heavy whipping cream does that in a way that a half and half or, whole milk or reduced fat milk
Mhm.
wouldn't. And then in terms of honey, I'll usually add about a teaspoon of honey. And what I've found for me personally, I can do that, drink, first thing in my morning and have steady energy for hours. So it seems to really work for me.
Mhm.
But we all have to run our own experiments.
Yeah, yeah, our own N of one. Do you have a specific honey that you like? I mean, just any old honey will do.
Yeah, I mean, honeys can be one of the more adulterated
Yeah.
forms of food. So, I try to um, buy ones that are either locally grown at the farmer's market or go to, there's a sub place called Fraser Farms near me, which has some really good reputable honeys. Trader Joe's would be, a default. So,
Hmm.
um, yeah.
Got it. Love it. Okay, so we talked about L-theanine, talk about caffeine. Before we move on from caffeine, I just want to double down on this. You touched on maybe the mechanism of action that why people have that crash, that caffeine crash, which L-theanine will help to balance that. But let's talk about that. If L-theanine is not in the picture to balance that out, why does that crash happen after someone has that proverbial cup of caffeinated beverage, whatever that is, an energy drink or coffee?
Yeah. So I think the main thing goes back to energy. They're using more glucose at least locally in the parts of their brain that are more active, and they didn't have any to draw on with the caffeine. So they run short of resources and then need to either replenish them or get them from somewhere else. And replenish often then is, we crave something that might not be the healthiest way to get our blood sugar
Hmm.
stable again.
Yeah.
And then the other reason would be, I think, neurotransmitters. What
Hmm.
caffeine is also doing is it's causing us to use more, what are called neurotransmitters, things like your dopamine and acetylcholine. And so, sometimes having more building blocks for those things will be sufficient. That's why in Qualia Mind, as an example, we have um, N-acetyltyrosine as a building block for dopamine, and we have a couple
Hmm.
sources of choline as ways to have resources to make more acetylcholine. So that
Hmm.
that would be the other way.
Hmm.
That we're running out of neurotransmitters and other resources too quickly.
Got it. All right. Any other neurotropics that are the top of your list that you
So I
love?
love lutein and zeaxanthin, which are usually not thought
Same.
of as nootropic.
No. Right. I wouldn't necessarily. I know the cognitive, neuroprotective benefits, but yeah, explain why you put them on this list.
Yeah, so lutein and zeaxanthin are usually thought of as vision ingredients because they concentrate in the macula part of our eye, which is on the retina, so the back of the eye. And it's super important. They're almost like nature's blue light blockers for
Hmm.
that back. But they also concentrate in the brain, particularly the visual part of the brain. And there's really excellent studies on that combination of lutein and zeaxanthin long term, 6 months to a year, and
Hmm.
about 20 different studies that have looked at them for cognitive benefits. So every age group from university age up to elderly with diminishing memory, that those things do really well, but they're slow, right? They're
Hmm.
things that help visual memory and verbal memory and our brain, but it takes a prolonged period. And one
Yeah.
of the mechanisms is BDNF, which for listeners, BDNF is a brain-derived neurotropic factor, but it's a neuroplasticity compound that our brain makes.
Hmm.
So, neuroprotection you mentioned, and a lot of brain health is, dampening down inflammation and doing a better
Hmm.
job of protecting the brain because when those things happen, then the brain, tends to self-regulate better. So, anyways,
Yeah.
they're not classically thought of as nootropics in the sense that they're not felt, I take them today or over 5 days. They're slower acting, but super important brain
Yeah.
nutrients.
Yeah, brain nutrients for sure. Okay, so let me get your hot take on a few that comes to mind when I'm thinking of the brain and neurotropics or cognitive support. One is I get asked a lot. People want to know what's the deal with alpha GPC. What's the science say?
Yeah. So alpha GPC is a choline source. Another really well-studied one is called citicoline. They're both things that supply choline, so the precursor for acetylcholine. Both also super important to make membranes on our neurons and other cells. So, that's important because the receptors the neurotransmitters work on are in those membranes. So alpha GPC, um, I would say, would become so it is in Qualia, both of those are in Qualia Mind as an example. But I think of them as much more important in an aging brain than the cholinergic system in an aging brain seems to really misfire compared to younger people. So
Hmm.
the best studies on alpha GPC generally have been in that, older, pre-dementia type of brain. The same with cognizant. The studies in younger people, it's still beneficial, but in younger people, I think my main focus would be filling the nutritional gap between how much choline they should get in a good diet versus how much on average they get. And the gap's real and on average about, say, 110 milligrams. So you don't
Hmm.
need to do big amounts of alpha GPC in a younger person doing nootropics,
Hmm.
typically to get a benefit, where in an older brain you may have to do, hundreds, up to, I've seen a gram or more in studies of alpha GPC in some older folks.
Got it. Okay, love it. What's your take or thoughts on a phosphatidylserine?
Super important for the membranes. So, maybe the most important of the nootropic lipids. Generally, the amount 100 to 300 milligrams would be a good amount. Again, something that I think of as more an essential nutrient for the brain to really
Yeah.
repair and make sure the brain has all the resources needed. That higher amount, 300, in some studies has shown stress benefits, so people, will feel a little bit less stressed with phosphatidylserine. It wouldn't be my go-to for that. There's things that work quicker and better, like rhodiola, would be a much more,
Yeah.
impactful thing for stress, as an example.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about rhodiola too. We'll get to. What do you have a preference, phosphatidylserine or phosphatidylcholine? Do you like PC or PS like better? Do you feel like they both have their place as far as like supplement compounds are concerned?
Yeah, the thing I like about phosphatidylserine, so I know the phosphatidylserine we source for Qualia Mine would have some other phospholipids as well. So some amounts of phosphatidylcholine, phosphatidylethynolamine, some other, of that
It's like
category
a
of
entourage
lipids.
effect of it.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
you'd usually get some of those. I'm not aware of any phosphatidylserine that would be even like remotely pure, right? Always in a base of other phospholipids. It's just
Got it.
concentrated to that. Where phosphatidylcholine I love as well, but I would think of that more for liver health, or if I was really focused on healing membranes, which are important, right? There's,
Mm-hmm.
Patricia Kane's protocols and others for,
Mm-hmm.
healing membranes, where phosphatidylcholine takes center stage. As a nootropic, I wouldn't think of it as quite as important.
Got it. You mentioned rhodiola. It is one of my favorite adaptogens, and it is like it's always high on the research when you have the conversation around nootropics. So what's the deal there? Why is it so impactful when it comes to the brain?
Yeah, so rhodiola, I think, so I was an editor and contributing author for something called Alternative Medical Review for many years while it was being published. And around 2002, I think I wrote the first review article on PubMed on rhodiola.
Wow.
So the amount of research back then was, minimal compared to now. But even back then, its traditional use one of its traditional uses was what was called asthenia back in the day, like that sense of nervous system exhaustion. And in
Mm-hmm.
practice, it just seemed like a really good adaptogen for that nervous, frazzled, almost like too much sympathetic, like more a nervous system adaptogen than an adrenal adaptogen, if that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, that anxious and exhausted feeling, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and you put I know that you like it within the formula, so it kind of takes center stage. So you like the sort of synergistic effect it has with these other nootropics.
Yes. Yeah. And
Yeah.
this oversimplifies it, but it would be directionally correct. When we're trying, so Qualia Mind was designed with that mental energy triad first and foremost, right? We wanted to help people with focus, motivation, energy. Like I think of those as the big three. Memory, other
Mm-hmm.
things, of course, right? But those just
Mm-hmm.
take longer to develop. Um, and often what's preventing us from being there, especially with focus, is on one side, it would be almost lethargy, like lack of motivation, right? That would be your classic, often Adderall, ADHD, right? You're doing something stimulating to get them moved to that better focus place. But the
Mm-hmm.
other thing is the brain's almost too frazzled, right? That there's too much going on, and we need to like dampen that down to bring it back to that more homeostatic point. And with Qualia Mind, one of the goals was that no matter which end of that spectrum the brain was on, it would help bring it back to a more
Mm-hmm.
balanced spot, right? So
Yeah.
it's not it doesn't have super high amounts of caffeine and other things to overstimulate, and it balances them with L-theanine and botanicals, and then has things like the rhodiola that can help, if the brain's a little bit too frantic or frazzled, to start to
Mm-hmm.
gradually bring it back towards a more balanced place.
Yeah. So it's modulating versus like shifting in the brain in one way or the other. Another modulator, I think of it as a great modulator, is saffron, which I know that you're a fan of as well. Can you talk about what's the science say? Because I think it's such a, it's not enough people know about it, but it's really exciting.
Yeah, so I'll often like categorize different supplements as underrated, properly rated, and overrated. And saffron as a nootropic is crazy underrated. But for
Mm-hmm.
mood, it's appropriately rated. But in addition to, things in that mood category, it's a really, really felt nootropic, and you don't need a lot of it. So, and it tends to work a bit on that dopamine system. So for that, more lack of motivation and, inability to kind of get going, saffron
Mm-hmm.
can often be a really useful thing. And then great vision ingredient, good for, protecting the brain because of the antioxidants. So, um,
Mm-hmm.
like it's squarely in my underappreciated, underrated category.
Yeah.
Way better than
And
most people understand it to be.
yeah. How about acetyl L-carnitine?
Yeah, so acetyl carnitine is an acetyl group to carnitine. Carnitine, exists also as L-carnitine. Both are really important for converting fats into energy. And so think of it for metabolic flexibility. And
Mm-hmm.
the acetyl carnitine tends to be thought of as more the nervous system form, in part because it does have great bioavailability for the blood-brain barrier, and because of lots of different studies. So in addition to that making energy piece, it does a lot to heal the brain and, interacts with the dopamine system, that cholinergic system. So again, a really important ingredient. And
Mm-hmm.
metabolic flexibility, going back to that energy piece, like a lot of what's in Qualia Mind is to support brain energetics, because,
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, if we do well there, we tamper down inflammation, then the brain often on its own just starts to perform a lot better.
Yeah. So we're talking about these different, like, what's the scientific literature talk about these different compounds that are supportive of enhancing the brain and focus in different ways, in different pathways. What's your take on the stacking of these, like the sort of synergistic effect, if you will, because you're talking about this formula that you have to formulate, but what's your view of like taking a sort of stacking the neurotropics versus taking them individually or just one by themselves?
Yeah, so I think a stack, one, and we would believe this at Qualia, like no comprehensive stack is probably going to work for everyone. So, what we hold ourselves to is that when we do a study on one of our products, we're looking for about 80% of people to have a really good to awesome experience. And then we understand that for some people, it's not going to be the perfect thing for their brain. Um, and that's, I think, part of the reason we have a great money back guarantee for people, because we want to take that risk element out. And in the nootropic community, they would use the acronym your mileage may vary, YMMV. And the idea being that, what might work best for you or, some of our listeners and for me may not all be the same, which makes sense, right? Genetics and
Mm-hmm.
history and health and things like that. But getting back to your question, with a stack that's suitable for us will get more benefits because the complementary nature of some of
Mm-hmm.
these different things, like different mitochondrial supporting nutrients for energy, different things to support the cholinergic system, the dopamine system, things to get, a sufficient amount of alertness without too
Mm-hmm.
much. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm a big fan of stacking things together. And we could do that on our own. Most of us just don't, have the bandwidth or expertise to do it. So one of the things
Mm-hmm.
I think of as my job at Qualia is to make a product that for most people, they're going to feel like, oh, I noticed this. This is something that,
Mm-hmm.
really helped me bring my mental energy, my
Mm-hmm.
focus, up leveled.
Yeah. Plus, like the therapeutic benefit, the dosage amount that's in studies varies from compound to compound. So you're taking the guesswork out of it for people too, where you really can get this amazing synergistic effect of things like you said. Some are more stimulative, some are more calming, but the people, doctors, practitioners have been putting together formulas for thousands and thousands of years. This is just done in a modern way with what you've done, and I love this formula. It's such a smart formula. If you had to, like, I know that you're an advocate for cycling
Hmm.
the use of this. So, what's the specific protocol to get the most out of Qualia Mind? What do we do?
Yeah, so my work week runs Monday through Friday. So I take Qualia Mind early in my day, Monday through Friday. I take the weekends off. And my belief, and this would be the rest of the team at Qualia and our founders, is that except for things that we should do every day, like, thyroid medication or insulin, something that we need every day to do its proper physiological role, that, it's often a useful way to treat supplements that wouldn't be in that category, like you would say resistance exercise, where
Mm-hmm.
when I was in the Navy, as an example, I went to the gym every day and, would spend an hour, hour and a half in there. So I had the doing really well. I didn't have the recovery piece at all. And so,
Mm-hmm.
no surprise, I didn't get nearly the benefits that I would have had I paid attention to cycling more
Mm-hmm.
appropriately. And with supplements, I think the same general principle holds true that, especially things like adaptogens or caffeine will do better longer term if we don't use them every day, and build in appropriate breaks. So my break and what we recommend for most people is take 2 days off a week, and then once a quarter, maybe take a week or 2 weeks off,
Mm-hmm.
equivalent of what I would call deloading in a
Mm-hmm.
lifting sense, right? Like you either
Yeah.
go lower or take that break so that you prioritize recovery. So I would do
Mm-hmm.
the same personally with Quality of Mind.
So you're allowing the receptor sites to sort of have a break, the cells to take a break. Is that sort of the idea of why it's helping people to cycle?
Yeah, so that would be with caffeine as an example, right?
Yeah.
The goal is to have those receptor sites resensitized to caffeine, so you'd have more benefits from it. Again, for
Yeah.
adaptogens, I tend to think it's different mechanisms, maybe not receptors, but
Mm-hmm.
I think of adaptogens in a general sense as being things that cause a little stress and then force positive adaptations. But we also want then the opportunity to recover from even those
Yeah.
mild stressors.
Yeah. Those little hormetic agents. Yeah, for sure. All right. This has been great. I know there's a recent study done on cognitive health that used at least a part quality of mind in the intervention. Can you talk about the study? Because it's exciting stuff.
Yeah, so there's a naturopathic doctor named Heather Sanderson that happens to be in the same area that we're located. So she's been very supportive of Qualia from the early days. And several years ago, she one opened a medical home that caters to people with dementia or dementia-like symptoms that are, fairly well progressed. And then the brain and things with that are also a big part of her practice. So what she did was a study out of her office, not at the medical home, that used a Brednison type of approach,
Hmm.
which do you want to explain that to the audience, or do you?
Yeah, you can. Dr.
Oh
Dale
yeah,
Brent is in. He's brilliant at
yeah,
UCLA, correct?
I think so.
Yeah.
And his approach would be multifactorial and that would stack a lot of different nutrients
Yeah.
together.
A lot of different
Um,
supplements
yep.
and food changes. Yeah.
Yeah. So what she did, I think it was 34 people that, and they use a questionnaire called MOCA, MOCA, as kind of a grading system for where your memory is at with aging. So these candidates all had fairly poor memory. You know, they were well on the dementia continuum. And I believe it was a 6 month study. It comprehensively did things with diet and lifestyle. So she put a lot of like keto was a big part of it for an aging
Yeah. Which
brain.
is a part of Brednison's
Yep.
protocol too. Yeah.
And so she really implemented the Bredesen protocol, but one of the supplements she put all the people on was Qualia Mind. And she ended up publishing a study, and what they did was MOCA scores higher numbers are better. I want to say the average starting was around 18 and the ending was 24. So it moved like a crazy amount of memory restoration in a relatively short amount of time. And Qualia Mind, the way she described it, that was what she used as her multi-nutrient for the brain for
Yeah.
all of the people in that study.
Yeah. And that's how I see it, is quality of mind is like it's not a multivitamin, but you know what I mean? It's like a multi-nutrient, like the synergistic effect for the brain where you just take one serving it, cycle. How many capsules is it? It's like four
So
around.
we recommend 3 to 6. So six would
Okay.
be six would give like so for me, if I'm having a day I'm asking my brain to do more, I'll take 6. More
Mm-hmm.
normal day, I'll do 3 or 4.
Okay. Yeah, I normally have done four when I've done it. Okay. This is wonderful. What's next? I mean, you're such a you have such a deep knowledge for such a long time about in this space. What's next for you and what's next for Qualia?
So yeah, I'm at least for the foreseeable future still plan on being, part of the Qualia team. I think we're doing some really exciting things, and you know, I know the founders really want to impact, society in a meaningful way. And the brain was at the beginning where they felt like, oh, if we can, improve people's brain performance even a little bit, we'll have better social cognition and executive function, which translates into, we'll be better versions of ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
for ourselves and for other people. And so one of the cool things at Qualia is that, I get to consistently do deep dives into areas that, if we can deliver a good project or, a good product at the end, will make an impact on someone's health and well-being. And stem cells is something I've been working on. We'll be launching a product in April that we did about a year R&D on for joint health and made about a 60% improvement in
Wow.
people's joint issues over a month when we did our study on it. So yeah, so
Is
that
that
yeah, go
is
ahead.
that formula out yet? The joint
No,
support formula?
it won't be available. I think it's the first week in April. It will go on sale, and it's we'll have some available, to give out to people like you to try before that. I
Yeah.
think by the end of
Hey,
February. So
amazing. Pass it over. I'll give it a try. My friend, this has been a blessing. Oh, but before we go, I want to shoot out some questions. Every time I've missed it only a few times, but at the end of every episode, we have your art of being well. And when I miss it occasionally, I get comments from people that listen to the podcast and they say, well, you didn't do your art of being well with this guest. And I won't let them down. This is Dr. Gregory Kelly's art of being well. What is the worst tasting healthy food that you eat for its benefits, the science benefits behind it, not for the taste?
so for me, it would be beets. I genetically am one of those people that beets taste like dirt too. So I don't, but
Same here.
I know conceptually they're really good for me.
Yeah.
Spirulina would be another, though I wouldn't put it like most of those things I've acquired some degree of
Yeah.
like liking them. I think, do you know what flavor learning is?
No, tell me about it.
So I wrote a chapter in my book on flavor learning, but the flavor learning, the gist of it is for most things we don't have a taste bud for, right? Salt would be an exception, sweet maybe. So the way we learn about foods is pairing flavor with it. So the way it would work, if say you made a rat vitamin B1 deficient, it wouldn't be able to taste B1 in any of the food. But if there was a food source of B1, it would eventually find that and then eat it
Mm,
until it corrected it. It would learn somehow that that was good for it and pair that with the flavor. So that's flavor learning.
I
So
love it.
because of that, things that taste bad, if they are actually good for us, we tend to learn to like them
Hmm.
flavor over time, right?
Hey,
So
I see it. I see that clinically. People say it all the time. They acquired a taste. That's what's happening.
yeah, yeah, we just
Flavor
have to be
learning.
patient to get past that learning stage.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. What is the weirdest, most out of the box thing that you've done for your wellness that you're willing to admit on a podcast, Greg?
Drinking my urine specifically back in naturopathic school. So
Yeah,
a
which
bunch,
is
not,
still a thing in
yeah.
certain sects. People still do it. Tell me tell everybody what's the story behind it.
So I don't remember who instigated it, but there was a group of us that ran that experiment at some point. And I think the general idea, there's things in our urine, like stem cells and other things that are
Yeah.
rejuvenating. So I think one of the stories I remember from way back then was someone that had been trapped in a building and didn't have water. And in the time period while they were, trying to dig him out, he drank his own urine and came out, you know, way healthier than you would have expected. But however, whatever it happened, I got talked into doing that. The other
What?
would have
Yeah.
been, do you know the plant lobelia?
Not really. Tell me about it.
So
I've heard
lobelia
of
is
it, but I don't know much about it.
it's an herb, but with a fairly low threshold before it becomes toxic. And
Okay.
did you ever read The Count of Monte Cristo, any
Oh
chance?
yes, yes.
Yeah, so there's a scene in that where they know the old man, I can't remember his name, is going to get poisoned. They know what it is. So in a hermetic sense, they
Yeah,
give
the
him,
dose makes the poison. Yeah.
right, give him gradually more. So when he is eventually poisoned, he survives it. So I did that with lobelia. I started at like one drop and was progressively
Microdosing lobelia.
doing more and more and got to a point that I think I was just above the threshold where it's supposed to be really bad and freaked out my classmates at the time and they did an intervention. So,
Why did you do this with the lobelia?
oh, at the time I was, so naturopathic school, I was constantly running some experiment on the side to kind of keep myself intrigued, right? Otherwise, you were just having people talk at you a lot
Yeah,
for the day.
right.
So I
I
would
love it.
always pick some weird experiment to run in the background.
I love it. And the urine, can you describe the taste for people out there that will never do it themselves but are curious?
The closest thing would be like just a pure celery juice would be my recollection, right? This goes way
Would
back.
you, if one were to do it, would you recommend it straight up or cooled?
So one I wouldn't recommend doing it, but I think at the time we just did it straight up.
Oh
So
man. Yeah, yeah. That was my next question. Would you do it again? No. Doesn't sound like it.
yeah, I mean I don't think there was like if circumstances and I had to drink
Yeah.
it, I
If you were
wouldn't.
ever like stuck in
Yeah,
a cave for a month,
like
then you would.
100% could do it with no
Yeah,
forced
to
exposure.
survive.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
but
Let's not be
I don't know that
above
there's
it to survive.
any like real substantial health benefits to make running that
Yeah.
experiment worthwhile.
Yeah. Agreed. All right, my friend. Where do people go to learn about this amazing stuff? I have a specific URL for people. It's qualialife.com/will. Just qualialife.com/will. And they can use code will to get an additional 15% off. Thanks so much for that. So that was what I wanted to make sure everybody got. But anywhere else people should go?
The Qualia Instagram is maybe our main social outreach channel, and we put a lot of great content on that. So, I highly recommend for listeners, checking us out on Instagram. And then for something like, Qualia Mind, I write a long blog post and every one of the Qualia products. So someone that wanted to get really into the weeds about the product and mental energy, then, on our website under blogs, you'd be able to find a really deep dive on Qualia Mind.
Amazing. I'll put that all in the show notes, guys, but it's qualialife.com/will. Use code will to get that extra 15% off. Oh, and Doc, tell people about your book. You mentioned your book, Shapeshift. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so it came out. I wrote it and published it about 2012, I think, is when it came out, and it was what I would say a complex systems approach to weight. So one of the things about the brain that we didn't get into is the brain's really a prediction system. So its main job is predicting the future, so it knows how to budget its energy and resources. And so I wrote Shapeshift in large part to help people better understand how I felt how the system of fat cells and all the things that interact actually do respond to the environment and circumstances to determine, how much fat we have. And like as an example, one of the studies in the book was Biosphere 2, which was in the early 90s. It was some scientists and researchers that lived in this big dome in outside Tucson for a year, and they couldn't grow enough food. So they were slightly but consistently calorie deprived for the entire time. So of course they lost weight. Some of the blood work that you would measure, and I'm sure the listeners would know, some look like it changed in a positive direction, some not. Long story short, when they came out and had access to food, they really quickly regained all the lost weight, but 100% as body fat. So they were fatter than before, even though they returned to the same weight. And that seems to be that system that's predicting the future, saying something like, geez, I don't know when this idiot's going to go and starve themselves for a year. I'll be better prepared next time. So,
Yeah.
The book gets into things, from that perspective, flavor learning, rather than saying, do this, don't do that for food. It's like, oh, this is how we learn about food. Like, this is flavor learning. Let's understand this. I talked about, sleep and its role in weight, way back then, which, has become much more well known, but 12 years ago, no one was talking about really.
Yeah. Yeah. My friend, you're ahead of your time for sure. Come back on the pod anytime, my friend. This has been great.
I've loved it. Thank you.